Welcome everyone. It is 3 p.m. and it's time for the Server Room Show. This is episode 79. Today the topic is IBM's OS2, and I'm already sure that I'm not going to be able to finish in one episode, but let's see. Let's see how much material I have here. Introduction. OS2 is a series of computer operating systems initially created by Microsoft and IBM under the leadership of IBM software designer Ed Iacobucci. As a result of a feud between the two companies over how to position OS2 relative to Microsoft's new Windows 3.1 operating environment at that time, the two companies severed the relationship in 1992, and OS2 development fell to IBM exclusively. The name stands for Operating System /2 because it was introduced as part of the same generation change release as IBM's Personal System /2, the PS/2 line of second generation personal computers. The first version of OS2 was released in December 1987, and newer versions were released until December 2001. OS2 was intended as a protected mode successor of PC-DOS. Notably, basic system calls were modeled after Microsoft DOS calls. Their names even started with DOS, and it was possible to create family mode applications, text mode applications that could work on both systems. Because of this heritage, OS2 shares similarities with Unix, Xenix, and Windows NT. IBM discontinued its support for OS2 on the 31st of December 2006. Since then, OS2 has been developed, supported, and sold by two different third-party vendors under license from IBM. First by Serenity Systems as Ecom Station since 2001, and later by Arca Noah LLC as Arca OS since 2017. The development history of OS2 starts with the joint development era between 1985 and 1989. The development of OS2 began when IBM and Microsoft signed the joint development agreement in August of 1985. It was codenamed CP/DOS, and it took 2 years for the first product to be delivered. OS2 1.0 was announced in April 1987 and released in December. The original release is text mode only, and the graphical user interface was introduced with OS2 version 1.1 about a year later. OS2 features an API for controlling the video display and handling keyboard and mouse events, so that programmers writing for protected mode need not call the BIOS or access hardware directly. Other development tools included a subset of the video and keyboard APIs as linkable libraries, so that family mode programs are able to run under Microsoft DOS, and in the OS2 extended edition version 1.0, a database engine called the Database Manager, or DBM. This was related to DB2 and should not be confused with the DBM family of database engines for Unix and Unix-like operating systems. A task switcher named Program Selector was available through the Control Escape hotkey combination, allowing the user to select among multitasked text mode sessions or screen groups. Each can run multiple programs. Communications and database-oriented extensions were delivered in 1988 as part of OS2 1.0 Extended Edition. SNA, X25, APPC LU 6.2, LAN Manager, Query Manager, SQL OS2 1.1 was the first version to feature the Presentation Manager graphical user interface. The promised user interface Presentation Manager was introduced with OS2 1.1 in October of 1988. It had a similar user interface to Windows 2.1, which was released in May of that year. The interface was replaced in version 1.2 and 1.3 by a look closer in appearance to Windows 3.0. The extended edition of version 1.1, sold only through IBM sales channels, introduced distributed database support to IBM database systems and SNA communication support to IBM mainframe networks. In 1989, version 1.2 introduced installable file systems and notably the HPFS file system. HPFS provided a number of improvements over the older FAT file system, including long file names and a form of alternate data streams called extended attributes. In addition, extended attributes were also added to the FAT file system. The extended edition of version 1.2 introduced TCP/IP and Ethernet support. OS2 and Windows-related books of the late 1980s acknowledged the existence of both systems and prompted OS2 as the system of the future. The next step in the history of the development is in 1990, the Breakup. The collaboration between IBM and Microsoft unraveled in 1990 between the releases of Windows 3.0 and OS2 version 1.3. During this time, Windows 3.0 became a tremendous success, selling millions of copies in its first year. Much of its success was because Windows 3.0, along with Microsoft DOS, was bundled with most new computers. OS2, on the other hand, was available only as an additional standalone software package. In addition, OS2 lacked device drivers for many common devices such as printers, particularly non-IBM hardware. Windows, on the other hand, supported a much larger variety of hardware. The increasing popularity of Windows prompted Microsoft to shift its development focus from cooperating on OS2 with IBM to building its own business based on Windows. Several technical and practical reasons contributed to this breakup. The two companies had significant differences in culture and vision. Microsoft favored the open hardware system approach that contributed to its success on the PC. IBM sought to use OS2 to drive sales of its own hardware, including systems that could not support the features Microsoft wanted. Microsoft programmers also became frustrated with IBM's bureaucracy and its use of lines of code to measure programmer productivity. IBM developers complained about the terseness and lack of comments in Microsoft's code, while Microsoft's developers complained that IBM's code was bloated. The two products have significant differences in API. OS2 was announced when Windows 2.0 was near completion and the Windows API already defined. However, IBM requested that this API be significantly changed for OS2. Therefore, issues surrounding application compatibility appeared immediately. OS2 designers hoped for source code conversion tools, allowing complete migration of Windows application source code to OS2 at some point. However, OS2 1.x did not gain enough momentum to allow vendors to avoid developing for both OS2 and Windows in parallel. OS2 1.x targets the Intel 8286 processor and DOS fundamentally doesn't. IBM insisted on supporting the 8286 processors with its 16-bit segmented memory mode because of commitments made to customers who had purchased many 8286 based PS2s as a result of IBM's promises surrounding OS2. Until release 2.0 in April of 1992, OS2 ran in 16-bit protected mode, and therefore could not benefit from the Intel 8386's much simpler 32-bit flat memory model and virtual 8086 mode features. This was especially painful in providing support for DOS applications. While in 1988 Windows 386 version 2.1 could run several cooperatively multitasked DOS applications, including expanded memory EMS emulation, OS2 version 1.3 released in 1991 was still limited to one 640 kilobyte DOS box. Given these issues, Microsoft started to work in parallel on a version of Windows which was more future-oriented and more portable. The hiring of Dave Cutler, former VAX VMS architect, in 1988 created an immediate competition with the OS2 team, as Cutler did not think much of the OS2 technology and wanted to build on his work on the Mika project at Digital rather than creating a DOS plus. His NT-OS2 was a completely new architecture. IBM grew concerned about the delays in development of OS2 2.0. Initially, the companies agreed that IBM would take over maintenance of OS2 version 1.0 and development of OS2 version 2.0, while Microsoft would continue development of OS2 version 3.0. In the end, Microsoft decided to recast NT-OS2 version 3.0 as Windows NT, leaving all future OS2 development to IBM. From a business perspective, it was logical to concentrate on a consumer line of operating systems based on DOS and Windows, and to prepare new high-end systems in such a way as to keep good compatibility with existing Windows applications. While it waited for this new high-end systems to develop, Microsoft would still receive licensing money from Xenix and OS2 sales. Windows NT's OS2 heritage can be seen in its initial support for the HPFS file system, text mode OS2 1.x applications, and OS2 LAN manager network support. Some early NT materials even included OS2 copyright notices embedded in the software. One example of NT-OS2 1.x support is in the Win2K resource kit. Windows NT could also support OS2 1.x presentation manager and AVO applications with the addition of the Windows NT add-on subsystem for presentation manager. The next step in the development history is 1992, the 32-bit era. OS2 version 2.0 was released in April of 1992. At the time, the suggested retail price was $195, while Windows retailed for $150. OS2 2.0 provided a 32-bit API for native programs through the OS itself, still contained some 16-bit code and drivers. It also included a new OOUI, object-oriented user interface called the Workplace Shell. This was a fully object-oriented interface that was a significant departure from the previous graphical user interface. Rather than merely providing an environment for program windows, such as the program manager, the Workplace Shell provided an environment in which the user could manage programs, files, and devices by manipulating objects on the screen. With the Workplace Shell, everything in the system is an object to be manipulated. DOS compatibility. OS2 2.0 was touted by IBM as a better DOS than DOS and a better Windows than Windows. It managed this by including the fully licensed Microsoft DOS 5.0, which had been patched and improved upon. For the first time, OS2 was able to run more than one DOS application at a time. This was so effective that it allowed OS2 to to run a modified copy of Windows 3.0, itself a DOS extender, including Windows 3.0 applications. Because of the limitations of the Intel 8286 processor, OS2 1.x could run only one DOS program at a time, and did this in a way that allowed the DOS program to have total control over the computer. A problem in DOS mode could crash the entire computer. In contrast, OS2 2.0 could leverage the virtual 8086 mode of the Intel 8386 processor to create a much safer virtual machine in which to run DOS programs. This included an extensive set of configuration options to optimize the performance and capabilities given to each DOS program. Any real mode operating system such as 8086 Xenix could also be made to run using OS2's virtual machine capabilities, subject to certain direct hardware access limitations. The OS2 2.0 like most 32-bit environments, OS2 could not run protected mode DOS programs using the older VCPI interface, unlike a standard mode of Windows 3.1. It only supported programs written according to DPMI. Microsoft discouraged the use of VCPI under Windows 3.1, however, due to performance degradation. Unlike Windows NT, OS2 always allowed DOS programs the possibility of masking real hardware interrupts, so any DOS program could deadlock the machine in this way. OS2 could, however, use a hardware watchdog on selected machines, notably IBM machines, to break out of such a deadlock. Later release 3.0 leveraged the enhancements of newer Intel 8486 and Intel Pentium processors, the virtual interrupt flag, which was part of the virtual mode extensions, to solve this problem. Windows 3.x compatibility with Windows 3.0 and later Windows 3.1 was achieved by adapting Windows user mode code components to run inside the virtual DOS machine, VDM. Originally, a nearly complete version of Windows code was included with OS2 itself, Windows 3.0 in OS2 2.0, and Windows 3.1 in OS2 2.1. Later, IBM developed versions of OS2 that would use whatever Windows version the user had installed previously, patching it on the fly and sparing the cost of an additional Windows license. It could either run full screen using its own set of video drivers, or seamlessly where Windows programs would appear directly on the OS2 desktop. The process containing Windows was given fairly extensive access to hardware, especially video, and the result was that switching between a full screen WinOS2 session and the workplace shell could occasionally cause issues. Because OS2 only runs the user mode system components of Windows, it is incompatible with Windows device drivers, VXDS, and applications that require them. Multiple Windows applications run by default in a single Windows session, multitasking cooperatively and without memory protection, just as they would under native Windows 3.x. However, to achieve true isolation between Windows 3.x programs, OS2 can also run multiple copies of Windows in parallel, with each copy residing in a separate VDM. The user can then optionally place each program either in its own Windows session with preemptive multitasking and full memory protection between sessions, though not within them, or allow some applications to run together cooperatively in a shared Windows session, while isolating other applications in one or more separate Windows sessions. At the cost of additional hardware resources, this approach can protect each program in any given Windows session and each instance of Windows itself from every other program running in any separate Windows session, through not from the other programs running in the same Windows session. Whether Windows applications are running in full screen or windowed mode and in one Windows session or several, it is possible to use DDE between OS2 and Windows applications and OLE between Windows applications only. The next step in the development history is the time between 1994 through 1996, called the Warp years. Released in 1994, OS2 version 3.0 was labeled as OS2 Warp to highlight the new performance benefits and generally to freshen the product image. Warp had originally been the internal IBM name for the release. IBM claimed that it had used Star Trek terms as internal names for prior OS2 releases, and that this one seemed appropriate for external use as well. At the launch of OS2 Warp in 1994, Patrick Stewart was to be the master of ceremonies. However, Kate Mulgrew of the then upcoming series Star Trek Voyager was substituted at the last minute. OS2 Warp offers a host of benefits over OS2 2.1, notably broader hardware support, greater multimedia capabilities, internet compatible networking, and it includes a basic office application suite known as IBM Works. It was released in two versions, the less expensive red spine and the more expensive blue spine, named for the color of their boxes. Red spine was designed to support Microsoft Windows applications by utilizing any existing installation on Windows on the computer's hard drive. Blue spine includes Windows support in its own installation, and so can support Windows applications without a Windows installation. As most computers were sold with Microsoft Windows pre-installed and the price was less, Red Spine was the more popular product. OS2 Warp Connect, which has full LAN client support built in, followed in mid-1995. Warp Connect was nicknamed Grape. In OS2 2.0, most performance-sensitive subsystems, including the graphics and the multimedia systems, were updated to 32-bit code in a fixed pack and included as part of OS2 2.1. Warp 3 brought about a fully 32-bit windowing system, while Warp 4 introduced the object-oriented 32-bit display driver model. In 1996, Warp 4 added the Java and the speech recognition software. IBM also released the server editions of Warp 3 and Warp 4, which bundled IBM's LAN server product directly into the operating system installation. A personal version of Lotus Notes was also included with a number of template databases for contact management, brainstorming, and so forth. The UK distributed the free demo CD-ROM of OS2 Warp essentially contained the entire OS and was easily, even accidentally, cracked, meaning that even people who liked it did not have to buy it. This was seen as a backdoor tactic to increase the number of OS2 users in the belief that this would increase sales and the demand for third-party applications and thus strengthen OS2's desktop numbers. This suggestion was bolstered by the fact that this demo version had replaced another which was not so easily cracked, but which had been released with trial versions of various applications. In 2000, the July edition of Australian Personal Computer magazine bundled software CD-ROMs, including a full version of Warp 4 that required no activation and was essentially a free release. Special versions of OS2 2.11 and Warp 4 also included symmetric multiprocessing SMP support. OS2 sales were largely concentrated in networked computing used by corporate professionals. However, by the early 1990s it was overtaken by Microsoft Windows NT. While OS2 was arguably technically superior to Microsoft Windows 95, OS2 failed to develop much penetration in the consumer and standalone desktop PC segments. There were reports that it could not be installed properly on IBM's own Aptiva series of home PCs. Microsoft made an offer in 1994 where IBM would receive the same terms as Compaq, the largest PC manufacturer at that time, for a license of Windows 95 if IBM ended development of OS2 completely. IBM refused and instead went with an IBM first strategy of promoting OS2 warp and disparaging Windows, as IBM aimed to drive sales of its own software as well as hardware. By 1995, Windows 95 negotiations between IBM and Microsoft, which were already difficult, stalled when IBM purchased Lotus SmartSuite, which would have directly competed with Microsoft Office. As a result of the dispute, IBM signed the license agreement 15 minutes before Microsoft Windows 95 launch event, which was later than their competitors, and this badly hurt sales of IBM PCs. IBM officials later conceded that OS2 would not have been a viable operating system to keep them in the PC business. Workplace OS. In 1991, IBM started development on an intended replacement for OS2 called Workplace OS. This was an entirely new product, brand new code that borrowed only a few sections of code from both the existing OS2 and AIX products. It used the entirely new microkernel code base intended eventually to host several of IBM's operating systems, including OS2, as microkernel personalities. It also included major new architectural features, including a system registry, JFS support for Unix graphics libraries, and new driver model. Workplace OS was developed solely for Power platforms, and IBM intended to market a full line of Power PCs in an effort to take over the market from Intel. A mission was formed to create prototypes of these machines, and they were disclosed to several corporate customers, all of whom raised issues with the idea of dropping Intel. Advanced plans for the new code base would eventually include replacement of the OS 400 operating system by Workplace OS, as well as a microkernel product that would have been used in industries such as telecommunications and set-top television receivers. A partially functional pre-alpha version of Workplace OS was demonstrated at Comdex, where IBM used Bill Gates stopped by the booth. The second and last time it would be shown in public was at an OS2 user group in Phoenix, Arizona. The pre-alpha code refused to boot. It was released in 1995, but with 990 million US dollar being spent per year on development of this as well as Workplace OS, and no possible profit of widespread adoption, the end of the entire Workplace OS and OS2 product line was near. I will continue from here on towards the downsizing and then the fading out of OS2, continuing to third-party development and the rest of the story, and then talk about the features and technology in OS2 and some of the third-party what happened after when the third parties took over, continued the OS2 development. As I mentioned in the very beginning, one was called Ecom Station since 2001, and then later now it's Arca OS since 2017. I will talk about those two as well in the next episode, episode 80 of OS2 part 2. Thank you very much for listening, and see you next Saturday.